These kids seemed perfectly intelligent, but they didn't know really basic things about the world. Like they didn't know what the Supreme Court was. And I'm in DC, we worked 17 blocks from the Supreme Court, but they didn't know what it was, what it did.
Welcome to Toddle School Leaders Project. I'm your host, Cindy Blackburn, and today I'm talking with Natalie Wexler. She's the co-author of my favorite literacy book, The Writing Revolution, and she's just published her newest book, Beyond the Science of Reading. So if you're curious about exactly what the science of reading is, we take a deep dive into the importance of connecting literacy to content and how we can use terms from science like cognitive load theory to really enrich our literacy practice. Let's jump into the episode. Natalie Wexler, I am so excited to have you on the School Leaders Project. Thanks so much for joining me here.
Well, thanks, Cindy. Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
I'd love for you to kind of set the stage for our audience. Just tell us a little bit about the work you do and the work that you're most passionate about.
Well, I'm an education writer, and what I really focus on is literacy and cognitive science and fairness, because our system tends to exacerbate inequalities that are already present in society. And if we look to the principles of cognitive science that have a lot of evidence behind them, we can see that there are ways in which our approach conflicts with what science tells us will work. And the negative effects of our approach, all of it well-intentioned, actually falls most heavily on students from less highly educated families who are also usually have fewer resources.
I'm so excited to dig into so much of what you said there. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that you're one of the co-writers of The Writing Revolution, which was one of the most transformative works for me. It was just so practical, and it was a way to transform the literacy practice in my classroom. So might you tell us a little bit about working on that book and just the aha moments there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I wrote this book, The Knowledge Gap, which came out in 2019, but I'm not sure that I would have ever written that book if I hadn't met Judy Hockman, who is the creator of the Writing Revolution method. The anecdote behind that is I had volunteered. I was writing about education for a news website in DC, and I really wanted to know why there was this large and stubborn gap in reading scores, other academic outcomes between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And I decided to volunteer in a high poverty school, high school, because it seemed like high school was where everything fell apart. And I thought, well, I'd like to be useful and helpful, so I'll volunteer to tutor some kids in writing. And also maybe I'll get some insight into what's falling, why are things falling apart at the high school level. Well, I quickly discovered that I was not adequate as a volunteer to deal with the writing problems that students had. They just hadn't been taught like how to construct a sentence. And they also, I noticed, had big gaps in background knowledge that they were preventing them from understanding the things I was asking them to read and write in response to. And I could not understand like where these gaps, these kids seemed perfectly intelligent, but they didn't know really basic things about the world. Like they didn't know what the Supreme Court was. And I'm in DC, we worked 17 blocks from the Supreme Court, but they didn't know what it was, what it did. And I read this article that appeared, this was in 2012, it was a while ago, called The Writing Revolution. That was in the Atlantic magazine. And I read that and I thought, this is exactly what these kids need. Because it described a method of writing instruction that both explicitly teaches kids how to write, including beginning with constructing sentences. What is a sentence as distinct from a fragment of a sentence, all of that stuff. And it also built and reinforced their knowledge of whatever it was they were reading and writing about. And I won't go into all the details, but eventually I got to meet Judy Hockman, who was the creator of that method. And I thought, I was on the board of a charter school at the time, an elementary school, and I thought, it would be great if that school could use this method of writing instruction. So I asked Judy to look into that, and she came back to me and said, well, the problem is that this method only works if it's embedded in content in the curriculum. And your school isn't teaching any content. And I was like, what? What are they teaching? It's a school. I thought I knew that what they were doing. I was on the school performance committee. So she explained to me that elementary schools were actually not focusing on content and getting kids to acquire any substantive knowledge, but we're rather focusing on things like reading comprehension skills.
Mm,
Um,
isolated.
and it doesn't really matter what you're reading as long as you're mastering a skill like finding the main idea. So Judy was the one who explained that to me. And also, I learned a lot from her about the role of writing, not just as a vital skill in itself, but also as a lever for deepening and reinforcing knowledge if you modulate the heavy cognitive load that writing imposes on kids. So you have to make it less overwhelmingly difficult.
Yes. And that book, it doesn't just talk about theory of, oh, this is theoretically how we might do that. It has such practical strategies. I remember reading it and just like wanting to cry as a teacher and just think, like, I wish I could go back in time and reteach all of my students writing because, especially when they got to me in fifth grade, they were writing essays and I didn't know where to begin. And this was like, no, just start with sentences. And until every kid can master a sentence, we don't go to the next level. And there was so much freedom in that and so much structure. And it was just, oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you just in the last few weeks how many teachers I've been, going around the country speaking, and they come up to me and say something along the lines of, "The writing revolution changed my life."
It's legit. So yeah, if people are looking for a starting place to engage with this work, I would definitely suggest starting with that book and starting to think about the ways that you're intentionally teaching content. But I also want to spend a lot of time on your newest book, which is Beyond the Science of Reading. But I think a lot of the people in our audience might be playing catch up. So might we begin by just describing what exactly is the science of reading?
Well, that is a kind of loaded question because it has come to be defined like in the media. If you read something about the science of reading, what it sounds like it is all about is phonics, just
Right.
teach phonics, and that is part of it. There's a lot of scientific evidence relating to the need to teach phonics explicitly and systematically. Maybe half or more of kids probably won't become proficient readers unless you do.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of other science out there related to other aspects of reading, like, for example, reading comprehension. And so I'm arguing in this new book and elsewhere that we really need to define the science of reading to include the science relating to reading comprehension. And the tricky part of that is that teachers already think that they are teaching reading comprehension and what by teaching these skills and strategies. And there is evidence, don't get me wrong, there is evidence that some of these strategies, if you teach them to kids, that it improves their reading test scores. But there is also evidence that, undisputed evidence that knowledge plays a huge role in reading comprehension. The more knowledge you have, either relating to the topic or just general academic knowledge and vocabulary, the better your chances of understanding what you're trying to read. So I think I'm not rejecting the science that shows, yes, certain kinds of comprehension strategy instruction can work, but that does not support what people are doing in classrooms to try to teach comprehension.
Hmm.
Those are sort of, laboratory type studies where they try to isolate this one thing. What if we teach making inferences or main idea or whatever? But what really works in real life is to put the content in the foreground. So rather than teaching the skill of comparing and contrasting and using a text to try to teach that skill and then having kids go off to try to practice that skill and master that skill using text on a bunch of other topics that they may or may not know anything about, what works best is to teach a text, a rich text or a topic that you're spending maybe a few weeks on, and bring in whatever skills and strategies are going to help students understand that particular text and that particular topic.
So I guess what I'm hearing is letting content drive the bus as opposed to isolated strategies. So can we give an example, like in a classroom that would typically be teaching compare and contrast, what it would look like, as opposed to one that's considering the science of literacy, the science of learning?
Yeah, so I've been in classrooms where the skill of teaching compare and contrast was basically done by having two kids come up to the front of the class who were wearing different outfits, and let's compare and contrast what they're wearing. Okay, now go off and read something that's at your reading level Just go to the basket that matches your reading level and practice the skill of comparing and contrasting on whatever book you happen to choose.
Random topics, not connected to the larger unit or theme, just random topics
Right.
on your reading level.
Right. But, and a kid might be able to say, well, Sally's wearing a dress and Jenny is wearing pants. So, and that's comparing and contrasting. Yeah, we can all do that. But that doesn't mean that if they pick up a book about the solar system or, whatever, sharks, who knows, that they will be able to compare and contrast in the context of that text. And even if they can compare and contrast in the context of a text that's at their individual reading level, quote unquote, that doesn't mean that when they get to higher grade levels and they're reading about the French Revolution and the American Revolution, if they don't know anything about either of those historical events, that they will be able to compare and contrast. These are not generally applicable, transferable skills.
Right.
Whether you can apply a skill like that is going to depend to a large extent on the knowledge you have relating to the topic.
So instead, let's say I'm doing an ancient civilizations unit, and I decide in this unit I want to teach the skill of compare and contrast. What might that look like if I'm being mindful of the science of learning?
Well, that's a wonderful example because I actually have an anecdote that I think really illustrates how you would teach that. I mean, you're not just teaching the skill, how you're bringing that in and getting into students into that habit of mind, but you're also, in order for kids to apply that skill, they're going to have to draw on relevant knowledge. So for one of the things I did for the Knowledge Gap book was to follow a second grade classroom through a school year that was using a newly developed knowledge building curriculum. It was the only one that was available at the time because this was almost 10 years ago. It was called CKLA. And CKLA covers all these ancient civilizations. In first grade, it's ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And then in second grade, it's ancient India and ancient China. And so these kids had gotten this curriculum since kindergarten. And they were now in second grade, they were on to ancient Greece. Mm-hmm. And one day, the teacher asked the kids, okay, what was something unique about ancient Greek civilization? And all these hands went up. And these kids, by the way, they were all from low-income families. They were all children of color. This was not a gifted and talented class. But all these hands went up, and she called on one little boy who, and by the way, over half of these kids came from non-English speaking families. And this little boy happened to come from a Spanish speaking family. And he said something unique was that they weren't near a river and they didn't have any fertile land, so it was difficult for them to farm. I have those exact words because I recorded them. Now, nobody said he was comparing and contrasting. Unique, by the way, was one of that day's vocabulary words drawn from that day's reading. Nobody said he was comparing and contrasting, but he was, and he could not have done that if he hadn't learned a lot about ancient civilizations.
I love what feels so organic and authentic to me in this is that literacy is being used as a tool for exploring the world. And it's saying, in your life, you're going to have different interests and some of you are going to be interested in different topics, but literacy is a tool that you can use to understand and engage with the world. And we're showing that by by pairing it with really high quality content that matters to the curricular goals that we've set.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, we can't cover every bit of knowledge that kids are going to need in order to be successful. Schools cannot do that. The goal is to cover a critical mass of, it's really to develop a critical mass of general academic vocabulary. And there are different ways to do that. You can use different topics to do that. But vocabulary doesn't stick in the abstract. It needs a meaningful context. And so, and words need to be seen in different contexts repeatedly so that kids get the nuances of them. But a word, let's say like dynasty, which is going to be helpful throughout one's life, to understand what you're reading and learn about things you didn't learn about in school. So that's a good vocabulary word to know. But you could learn about that through learning about African dynasties, Asian dynasties, European dynasties, indigenous dynasties, whatever. So there are different ways to achieve that goal of enabling kids to draw on a store of academic knowledge and vocabulary.
And the heart of what you just said there is conceptual. And that if I'm a student who has a background, if my family is from Greece, I might be far more interested in learning about ancient Greece. And if my family is from Africa, I might be far more interested in learning about the African dynasties. And that we can both come to that word dynasty through rich content, but by looking at it conceptually, we have lots of ways that we can approach it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I love it. Let's pivot, because literacy instruction over the past couple of years has become very controversial. Might we begin with some practices that everyone should be letting go of?
Well, certainly this idea, treating these skills as though they were transferable. And here I'm talking about comprehension and writing.
Hmm.
Now, foundational skills, we do need to teach those directly as skills because those are transferable skills, like things like decoding words or forming letters,
Right.
Um,
They don't need to be embedded in content. It doesn't as much make sense if I'm learning to decode to say, okay, well now so they can be taught just in isolation as a skill.
right. And I think if you're teaching early literacy, especially, it helps to be aware that kids are going to be acquiring these different kinds of abilities on two different tracks, really. So the foundational skills they're going to be reading decodable texts, maybe
Mhm.
practicing fluency, and fluency is important even at higher grade levels. That's probably not how they're going to be acquiring new, knowledge and vocabulary of a new topic in the first instance.
Right.
That should come, and this is, I think, again, crucial, not just at lower grade levels, acquiring new information about a new topic through oral language. So, and
Mm.
especially read alouds, because the syntax and vocabulary of written language is almost always more complex than the syntax, sentence structure, and vocabulary we use in conversation. So, how are kids going to become familiar with that more complex syntax? One way is through listening to texts and then discussing them and using that vocabulary that they have just heard, talking about the concepts they have just heard about. That helps transfer that new information to long-term memory. And once it's stored there, if they read about the same or similar topic that they already have
Mm.
knowledge and vocabulary relating to, conceptual knowledge of, it's going to be easier for them to read texts on that topic. So but what we've been doing is making reading and writing harder than they need to be by asking kids to read and write about topics they may not know anything or much about.
Okay.
And that is just adding to that heavy load on what cognitive scientists call working memory, which is very limited. So working memory, which I don't think I've mentioned yet, is the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And it's been found that it can only, on average, hold about 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed. And if you're not yet a proficient reader, one of the burdens on working memory is going to be decoding the words or figuring out where the emphasis goes in a sentence. So this is why it has also been found that on average, kids' listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension through about age 13, or really
Huh.
until you're a proficient reader, because someone else is doing that work for you of decoding the words, of figuring out where the emphasis goes. And you can just devote your working memory capacity to understanding and absorbing the new information. And then once you have that information, I mean, we have evidence that once you have that information stored in long-term memory, you will probably be able to read about that topic at a higher level than the teacher might expect.
It's so funny. It makes me think about it. I was in Florida. I grew up in Florida, and we took the FCAT test. And I just think about that literacy test where it's like, you'd be reading one passage about the Iditarod, and then you turn 2 pages, and the next passage would be about, my mystery friend from abroad. And just,
Mhm.
I think about the cognitive load of that, of having to potentially, I've never even read about the Iditarod. And like,
Yeah.
I've never been to Alaska. I don't know any of this
Yes.
context,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, and that's very typical with, I mean, one of the things when I give presentations, I often show this slide that's a released item, a paragraph from a released item on a standardized reading comprehension test, and it's about the Inuit. And it uses all these words like caribou and, that many third graders, this is a third grade, sample, they will not understand. And supposedly the tests are measuring things like their abstract ability to just, find the main idea. But if you don't understand, half the words in a paragraph, how are you going to find the main idea? But also, in some schools, certainly in the United States, instruction has come to look like those tests.
Right.
because it's thought this is what's going to equip kids to do well on the tests. Let's give them a bunch of passages on random topics and ask them comprehension questions at the end of each passage. It has not worked.
Well, and when in life do you ever do that? Like when is like, oh, it's Thursday. I'm going to go to random Google article and learn about cricket
Yeah,
and then write some comprehensive questions about it. Like,
yeah,
no, it's not
yeah.
how our brains work. We're reading with a purpose and we're reading with intention. So I think coming back to that, okay, what is our larger theme? What is our content goal here? And how is literacy used as a tool for exploring it? Just makes so much sense.
And it's interesting you mentioned cricket because that is another one of the slides that I often use. But and one of the things that you hear is, oh, well, kids don't need to retain factual information because they can just Google stuff, you know. But I once tried Googling all the terms in this one paragraph describing a cricket match that I did not understand. And after 45 minutes, I still did not understand that paragraph. I couldn't understand the definitions. They were defining, words I didn't know using other words I didn't know. So there is a limit to what Googling will get you. Plus, breaking off reading and going off to Google words is a tremendous burden on working memory. It really interferes with comprehension. So it's much more efficient to just be able to really unconsciously withdraw that information from long-term memory when we need it.
Gorgeous. So just to summarize there, the practice to let go of would be teaching skills in isolation. So teaching, I'm working on the comprehension skill of summarizing. So I'm going to read 5 rando things and have kids summarize it. They could go read random books. So really embedding content and also being really clear of which skills are explicitly taught, that decoding and phonics, that those are skills that we should be explicitly teaching skill. Are we still doing that in like upper elementary, high school decoding and phonics, or where is that
Well,
at?
kids ideally will have the basics of phonics and decoding after second grade, but that doesn't mean they're inoculated against any future decoding difficulties because decoding multisyllabic words, which are the kind of words they're increasingly going to encounter as the grade levels go up, can be harder than decoding a word that's one syllable, a simple word that follows all the rules. So what kids at older grade levels will often need, they will need work on word identification. But in addition to just how do you connect the sounds to the letters that represent them, things like morphology, like prefixes and suffixes and word roots can be very helpful. So we do need to, I'm not saying background knowledge is the only reason that kids at higher grade levels might have trouble with reading comprehension. There are also these other things. And fluency has been called the bridge to comprehension. So a kid might be able to decode words, but not be able to do that at an appropriate pace with appropriate expression, and might be devoting so much cognitive capacity to just the work of decoding that they don't have the resources left available for comprehension. So we have to keep working on those decoding skills through, until kids are really fluent, proficient readers. It could be into high school for quite a few kids.
Have you come across a curricular resource that has these explicit literacy skills that don't need to be tied to content, but that has those really sequenced well and has those mapped out?
Well, you mean these things like morphology and
All of it.
etymology?
So starting from kindergarten up to here. So like the decoding skills, the fluency skills that you think really hits the nail on the head of the science of reading.
I would hesitate to name any curriculum because I'm not a curriculum expert. I mean, I kind of understand the principles that would underlie a good curriculum, and also I'm not an expert on the decoding side, so I'm a little hesitant to go into those waters.
Well, where do I go then? Like if I know, okay, I've got to be teaching this explicitly, like, but where do I find out what I should be explicitly teaching?
Well, there at the elementary level, there are now a number of curricula. There are some curricula that, I mean, you could go to a resource like the Reading League for good information on foundational skills. I think that they're pretty reliable on that, and something like the Knowledge Matters campaign, which I'm on the board of their parent organization, and they've identified some curricula that do a good job of building knowledge, some of which also do a good job with foundational skills. So there are
Cool.
some curricula out there, at least at the elementary and through middle school levels, that cover both the foundational skills and the knowledge building. And these things should be going on simultaneously. It's not like you should just be teaching foundational skills kindergarten through second grade. You should also be building knowledge through that other pathway, through oral language, read alouds, and discussion. So I mean, I think the best, if I were a teacher, what I would want is a really good curriculum that, I mean, no curriculum is going to be perfect,
Right.
but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are curricula, and I'm not as familiar with like the high school level, but there are curricula in elementary and middle grades that give you something to start with, and then you as a teacher can devote your energies and ideally with help from a coach or someone who really knows the curriculum well, with delivering that curriculum in the best way possible for your particular kids, but not figuring out what to teach and how to teach it from scratch.
Right. So as a curriculum coach then, or as a coach for instruction, two questions I might be asking in the literacy realm. One might be, what are those explicit, not tied to content skills that are grade level appropriate, and how and when are they being taught across the year? And what are the explicit opportunities to connect to content? So what are we learning about, and what's the best type of literacy skills to develop in connection with that?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to the non-decoding skills and even things like, prefixes, suffixes, word roots, it's a good idea to be guided by the content, like, well, and not just in English language arts or literacy, science, history, let's
Yeah.
the word paleontology. Let's talk about how this word is put together. Ology means the study of something. That could be helpful to kids when they encounter a word like archaeology. Oh, that must mean it's the study of something. So I think one of the reasons I wrote this newer book is I wanted to argue we need to break down these artificial walls we've erected between, well, first of all, between reading and writing, but secondly, between reading and writing and the content areas, because
Right.
they're really all connected. And we haven't really talked that much about writing, but I'll just say that writing is an excellent way to boost reading comprehension, and also to teach these skills and strategies, some of the skills and strategies that are considered to be reading comprehension strategies, like summarizing, which I think you mentioned, which summarizing, there's a lot of evidence that if you kids summarize things that they understand them better, they remember them better. But when we teach summarizing to the extent that we teach it, often, I think what we say is, well, just put in the important stuff and leave out the unimportant stuff. But,
How do you
the
know?
problem is a lot of kids don't know what the important stuff is. The best way that I've seen to teach summarizing is to teach it through writing. And so this is something, one of the things that the writing revolution method teaches is summarizing. But you don't teach it just by telling kids, put in the important stuff. Now go choose a book about, whatever you topic and summarize it. You start with common content because otherwise the teacher is not going to be able to teach the skill. And I think some of these higher order skills do need to be taught explicitly, like as summarizing does, but in the context of common content. So we're all going to learn about Louis Braille, for example. And here's a series of question words: who, what, where, when, why. Let's practice answering these question words and then taking that information and putting it all together in a summary. And
Gorgeous.
that is guiding students in how to, I mean, summarizing is not ever going to be a completely transferable skill like decoding words or riding a bicycle or whatever. It's always going to be easier to summarize a text on a topic you know a lot about versus
Right.
one that you don't know anything about. But if you know how to go about the process of summarizing, that gives you an advantage no matter what the topic is.
I love that. And I got to say it again. I can't speak highly enough to the writing revolution and how some of this can feel really theoretical, the partnership between content and writing. And it just breaks it down. Like one of my favorite exercises from the book is the and, but, or, right? So
Oh,
using conjunctions. So
but it's actually
because,
because, but
but
so,
so. Okay,
not
there we go.
and, not or.
So because, but so it would be like, King Tut was buried in a tomb, right? So King Tut was buried in a tomb because
Mhm.
he was a pharaoh, but I don't know, a
Yeah,
contradictory sentence.
yeah.
So he would move on to the afterlife,
Mhm.
and just even something simple like that as a morning routine, as a warm up to see, what do they remember from what we learned yesterday? And it's a writing check too. It's just when you marry the two, it's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean that's another reason I wrote the book, the recent book, because the argument is if you modulate that heavy cognitive load that writing imposes, and you embed writing activities in the curriculum content you're teaching, you will get all of the benefits of cognitive science informed instruction and more, because I mentioned that the syntax and vocabulary of written language is almost always more complex than what we use in conversation. If
Right.
you teach students how to use that syntax and how to use that vocabulary in their own writing, they're in a much better position to understand it when they come across it in their reading. So if you teach them, for example, how to use a subordinating conjunction like although,
Mhm.
they're going to be much better able to understand it when they encounter it in text.
I love it. Oh, I love it. Might we also talk a little bit about cognitive load theory, because it came into play. I saw you in Atlanta speaking at STL and ATL, and just loved your presentation. And cognitive load theory was a big chunk of it. So might you talk about what we have to learn from the science of cognitive load theory?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've already sort of hinted at it. So
Mhm.
cognitive load theory, there's a Australian cognitive psychologist named John Sweller who sort of coined the term, but it really describes how we take in new information and why it is so important to have, why it's so beneficial to have relevant knowledge stored in long-term memory. I mean, it has been said that I forget which cognitive scientist said this, but the most important determinant of what you can learn is what you already know. So, as I mentioned, so you take in new information, and the first place it goes, if you're paying attention, is working memory and very limited capacity. I mean, different individuals have different working memory capacities, but there's no reliable way to expand any individual's working memory capacity. So, on average, 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds. The way around those limitations is long term memory, which is potentially infinite. So, if we can just withdraw information from long term memory when we need it, we don't have to juggle that information in working memory, and that expands the capacity of working memory to take in new information, because too much
Mm.
cognitive load is going to really interfere with your ability to understand, retain, analyze what you're trying to take in. So, for example, if you're reading about baseball, and you already know what a double play is. You do not need to think, oh, what is that? Or, go off and Google it, which, as I mentioned, it poses a pretty heavy cognitive load. You can just
Or even like a
attend to
glossary.
whatever that article or whatever is trying to tell you about a baseball game.
Mm.
And so that explains why prior knowledge is so helpful. It also explains that why when learners are new to a topic, and this is where it's really been applied not so much to literacy, but to things like math, science, or history, whatever. But in that context where there is content, what
Mm.
cognitive load theory tells us is it is going to be much more effective when learners are new to a topic to provide explicit instruction, rather than having them try to discover things for themselves through
Fire.
inquiry, and that does not mean just lecturing. Explicit instruction should be very interactive. So
Right.
you clear explanations, clear models, but also a lot of checking for understanding, a lot of having students ask and answer questions and really be actively engaged.
Well, and knowing their learning styles, that why not have a couple of videos on the topic, and have a podcast on it, and have some books around the room, and just give some kids some time to explore and build that shared understanding, have a discussion before
Mhm.
launching into the reading.
I will just say that yes, it's great to have different ways that kids can take in information, but the concept of learning styles, which is very popular and
Mm.
widespread, cognitive scientists have been saying for a while there's actually no evidence to support the idea that, regardless of the material or the topic, that certain kids are always going to learn better in a particular modality, visual or kinetic or whatever it is. It's going to depend on what it is you're trying to teach. So I just wanted to add that footnote.
My favorite thinking on that comes from Katie Novak. She's Universal Design for Learning, and she talks about learning preferences
Mm.
and that variability is the rule. Like, just like I'm not going to get the same drink at Starbucks every time, that our kids, depending on the time of day or the subject or the topic, that they're going to learn differently and to have options for them to kind of taste test with.
And it's good to introduce things repeatedly. So there's something called retrieval practice, which is actually having kids recall information that they've stored in long-term memory. That the more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve it in the future.
Cool.
So you don't just teach something once and then never revisit it. It's a good idea to go back to things, to have students recall information they may have slightly forgotten. And you can use different ways, different modes to do that.
I love that. I heard recently that Gen Alpha, that their attention span is 5 seconds, which is less than a goldfish. Have you heard that? Or what does it make you think when you hear that?
No, in fact, I'm not even familiar with the term Gen Alpha, but I assume they're really young.
Yeah. So they're the next ones, right?
Uh, Well,
But
there's been a lot written about decreased attention spans lately, and I'm sure that it is true. But I think what that means for schools is that, I mean, we have to take account of decreased attention spans, but not just give in to them. I think we have to invest more effort in increasing students' attention spans because um, you need a lot, in order to understand and produce complex thought, you need to spend time with a thought, right?
right.
And just reading excerpts or is not it doesn't lead to the same quality of thinking that diving deeply into a text does. So schools, I think, need to make more of an effort maybe than they have in the past to help students acquire that ability to pay attention to a text specifically for a long period of time. Movies have apparently been getting longer, video games. I mean, people can pay attention to things other than reading text. I think it's really when we get to reading text that attention spans have shrunk noticeably.
So interesting. Yeah, I'm excited to read more about it. That's definitely on my list of things to learn about this year is attention span and attention. I heard a phrase, it was like attention restoration
Mm.
theory or something like that, that I'm really excited to learn more about.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about this. I want to pivot and put on our leader hats for a moment because we've talked a lot about educators and kind of the struggles they're facing, some shifts that they could make. If I'm a school leader listening to this, what are some first steps I might take towards shifting this culture in my school?
Well, I'd say it's crucial. It's not the only thing that would need to be done, but I would take a look at what the curriculum is. What does it look
Mhm.
like across the board? Are kids getting rich content beginning in kindergarten, or do you have an elementary school day that is dominated by reading and math and is a lot of that time spent on reading, just practicing those skills as though
Skills.
they were transferable? And here I'm talking about comprehension skills. And if that's the case, I would try to inject more content into that school day. And that can be done, you could spend less time on reading comprehension and more time on social studies, history, science. But I would say most of that time on reading comprehension really should be folded into the content areas. It's really hard, though, to get a lot of schools, at least in the United States, to reduce the amount of time they spend on reading. So that's why we've had these ELA reading curricula that spend a lot of time on topics in social studies and science as a way of getting it in the back door. But the idea is basically to combine literacy instruction with content area instruction as much as possible and having kids right across the curriculum. And that's another thing to look for. At higher grade levels, usually the problem is not so much lack of content as sometimes students difficulty accessing that content at the level that is expected.
Mm,
And at that point, I mean, I talked about morphology and etymology as being helpful, but writing instruction, and I would say a method like the writing revolution in particular, is probably your best bet for addressing those gaps in background knowledge and skills at higher grade levels. Because when kids write about what they are learning in any subject in a manageable way, they are engaging in that retrieval practice that makes new information, let's say, stickier. It helps transfer new information to long-term memory if you write about it. It helps you practice retrieving that information so it's going to be more available to you in the future, so that it will enable you to learn more and more easily. And also, the other thing that writing will provide is what cognitive scientists call elaboration or elaborative interrogation. And that means, it's a fancy word for saying you got to ask yourself questions like how and why, and can you give an example and answer those questions. And that is ideally what we do when we write. And that has been found to really help with comprehension. So, and I have seen, the Writing Revolution organization has worked with high schools and has seen some pretty amazing results. And it is hard to really, I mean, I'm talking like high poverty high schools. It's hard to turn things around at the high school level. And I think this kind of writing instruction is one of the very few things that can work.
So lovely. So really, as a leader, looking first at our curriculum and seeing, are there opportunities for more of a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to content? And then the second phase of that is, okay, we've got our content sorted and we know that we're teaching things worth learning. Now let's really hone in on those skills and where the gaps are and how we can explicitly instruct towards kind of leveling up those skills, and not assuming, oh, just because you're in high school, you should already have this.
Yeah.
But that if we're in ninth grade and we've got to go back to what is a fragment versus a sentence, let's do it. No shame. Let's get on the same page.
Yeah, it's not like just because kids are in ninth grade or 11th grade or 12th grade that they've automatically acquired all this knowledge. If it hasn't been taught in a way that's stuck in the past, that's where you need to start, no matter what grade level. And I would add, though, for leaders, that it's important for leaders themselves to understand all of these things we're talking about and explain to teachers why it's important to do something like teach writing beginning at the sentence level, and also provide support for them, because a lot of what we're talking about is not something that teachers will be used to. They haven't necessarily gotten training. A lot of teachers have not gotten good training in teaching writing. So ongoing support from like a coach and teachers collaborating can be really crucial too.
So cool. Well, I'm very excited for the future of literacy. So much of this, I'm coming from the PYP IB world. So much of this is what we've been doing there. Mm-hmm. And I love the idea of it starting to permeate more, especially into the US independent school world, of really being intentional of why we're teaching what we're teaching and using literacy and maths as, I don't know, a tool for solving problems as opposed to some random thing we're doing separated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I don't know that you can connect everything, but right. Certainly I would want every literacy teacher to also see themselves as a content teacher, and vice versa. Every content teacher should also be a literacy teacher.
Very, very cool. All right, my friend, thank you so much for joining. And I'm so excited to promote this new book. So tell us the title again and where we can find it.
It's called Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. And it's been published by ASCD. So, you should be able to find it pretty much anywhere.
So cool. Thanks so much for joining us, Natalie.
Sure thing. Thank you, Cindy.